all heard the saying, never judge a book by its cover. Yet every single day, people still do it. Expensive suits earn respect. Torn hoodies invite suspicion. That's exactly what happened when a tired, quiet man walked into an upscale restaurant looking for nothing more than a peaceful meal. Minutes later, the manager was pointing at him in front of everyone, calling him a poor bum, and ordering the police to drag him outside. What he didn't know was that the man sitting quietly in front of him wasn't looking for trouble. He was about to expose a truth that would cost the manager everything he had built. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see this incredible community joining us from every corner of the world. And we'd love to know which city or country you're watching from today. If you enjoy stories about humility, justice, and people who prove that kindness is worth more than appearances, don't forget to subscribe. We have many more unforgettable stories waiting for you. Keanu Reeves had one rule: never let success change the way you treat people. It sounded simple, but after building businesses, investing in companies, and earning more money than he'd ever dreamed of as a young man, he had learned something most people never did. The higher you climb, the easier it becomes to forget what the ground looks like. Keanu refused to forget. Every Friday evening, he disappeared. No assistance, no security, no expensive cars drawing attention. He would leave his office, drive an old pickup truck that still had over 200,000 miles on it, put on his favorite faded black hoodie, and spend the evening like any ordinary person. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. Years earlier, one of his business partners had laughed. "You know, you can afford better clothes." Keanu had smiled. "I can, so why don't you buy them?" He'd quietly answered, "Because I'd rather know who respects me before they know what I own." His friend never forgot that answer. That Friday had been exhausting. Meetings, contracts, phone calls, investors asking impossible questions. By 6 o'clock, his head ached. He didn't want another conversation about money. He wanted peace, a warm meal, and 30 quiet minutes. Nothing more. He parked several blocks away, not because there wasn't valet parking, because he enjoyed walking. The evening air was cool. Rain clouds gathered above the city. People hurried past him without a second glance, exactly the way he liked it. For a few minutes, he wasn't the owner of anything. He was simply another man, walking home from a long week. As he crossed the street, he noticed an elderly street musician trying to protect his guitar from the first drops of rain. Without saying a word, Keanu stopped, helped him move beneath the awning of a nearby bookstore. The old musician smiled. "I appreciate it." Keanu nodded. "Looks like the rain won." The musician laughed. "It usually does." Keanu reached into his pocket, placed a folded bill inside the open guitar case. The old man looked down. His eyes widened. "Sir," Keanu simply smiled. "Have a good evening." Then he continued walking, as though nothing unusual had happened. A few minutes later, he stopped outside Hawthorne Grill, one of the city's oldest restaurants. Elegant chandeliers glowed through the windows. Couples laughed over candlelit dinners. Business executives celebrated successful deals. It wasn't the fanciest restaurant in town, but the chef made one dish that Keanu genuinely loved. Sometimes, life's greatest luxuries were surprisingly ordinary. Inside, the atmosphere felt warm. Soft piano music drifted through the dining room. Fresh bread filled the air with its familiar aroma. A young hostess greeted him with a welcoming smile. "Good evening, sir. Table for one." Keanu smiled. "If you have one, we always do," as she led him through the dining room. A nervous young waiter accidentally bumped into him. The tray tilted dangerously. Wine glasses rattled. Everyone nearby gasped. Without thinking, Keanu reached out, steadying the tray before a single glass could fall. The waiter stared in disbelief. "I'm so sorry." Keanu smiled. "It happens. I almost ruined your evening." "No." Keanu gently patted the tray. "You saved it." The waiter blinked, then laughed. The tension disappeared instantly. Several guests watched the exchange. One elderly woman smiled. "What a gentleman." Her husband nodded. "You don't see patience like that much anymore." Not everyone shared that opinion. Standing near the bar, restaurant manager Gregory Bennett quietly observed everything. 20 years managing Hawthorne Grill. Perfect suit, perfect hair, perfect reputation. He believed appearances mattered. They always had. And the man wearing an old hoodie didn't belong in the picture he wanted customers to see. He called over the assistant manager. "Who's the customer in the corner?" "I'm not sure." "Reservation?" "I don't think so." Gregory frowned. "What table?" 17. Gregory looked again. Old boots, worn hoodie, simple jeans. Then he noticed Keanu's old pickup truck parked across the street through the restaurant window. His expression hardened. Something about the man didn't fit, or at least didn't fit the story Gregory had already created in his mind. Meanwhile, Keanu thanked the hostess and sat down. The corner table overlooked the rain-soaked street, exactly where he liked to sit, away from attention, away from noise. He picked up the menu, not to compare prices, to decide between two favorite meals. A cheerful waiter named Liam approached. "Good evening, sir. Can I get you something to drink?" "Just water, please." "And are you ready to order?" Keanu smiled. "I've been thinking about your beef medallions all week." Liam laughed. "Then I'd hate to disappoint you. I'll put that order in immediately." As Liam disappeared into the kitchen, Gregory quietly stepped into his path. What did he order? "The beef medallions." Gregory raised an eyebrow. Did he ask how much they cost? Liam looked confused. "No." Gregory folded his arms. "Interesting." Liam hesitated. "Sir, he seems nice." Gregory barely looked at him. "I've managed restaurants for 20 years. I know the difference between customers and people looking for a free meal." Across the dining room, Keanu sat quietly watching the rain, completely unaware that a man who had never spoken to him had already decided exactly who he was. Gregory straightened his vest. smoothed his tie, then started walking directly toward table 17. The restaurant continued buzzing with conversation. Wine glasses clinked. Soft piano music drifted through the dining room. Nobody noticed. One man was about to turn a peaceful evening into a public spectacle. Gregory stopped beside Keanu's table. He didn't greet him. He didn't smile. He simply stood there, looking down. Keanu glanced up from the menu. "Good evening." Gregory ignored the greeting. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." Gregory folded his arms. "Have you eaten here before?" "A couple of times. I don't remember seeing you." Keanu smiled politely. "I suppose that means I wasn't memorable." A few nearby diners chuckled quietly. Gregory didn't. Instead, his eyes drifted toward Keanu's hoodie, then to the old boots beneath the table, finally to the pickup truck parked across the street. His opinion had already become a verdict. "I'm afraid we have standards here." Keanu looked confused. "I'm glad to hear that." Gregory frowned. "I don't think you understand." Keanu calmly replied. "Then help me." The manager took a slow breath. "You've made several customers uncomfortable." Keanu slowly looked around the restaurant. Nobody was looking at him anymore. People had gone back to eating. He turned back toward Gregory. "May I ask how?" Gregory answered immediately. "Your appearance." The words hung in the air. Several nearby conversations stopped. People began turning toward the corner table. Keanu remained calm. "I wasn't aware there was a dress code." "There isn't," Gregory quickly answered. "But we do expect guests to present themselves appropriately." Keanu nodded thoughtfully. "So, you're asking me to leave because of my clothes?" Gregory didn't hesitate. "I'm asking you to leave because this restaurant has a reputation to protect." The silence spread further. Forks stopped moving. Even the pianist missed a note. Liam hurried over. "Sir, his meal is already being prepared." Gregory didn't even look at him. "Cancel it." Liam blinked. "But chef has already." "I said, cancel it." Keanu looked at Liam. "It's all right." The young waiter looked heartbroken. "I'm sorry." Keanu smiled gently. "You have nothing to apologize for." That answer somehow irritated Gregory even more. He pointed toward the entrance. "You need to leave." Keanu quietly folded the menu. "I've done nothing wrong." Gregory's voice became louder. "You don't belong here." Now, the entire restaurant was watching. A businessman whispered, "Just leave." Another guest shrugged. "It isn't worth arguing." A woman quietly muttered, "He should have gone the moment he was asked." Nobody asked what Keanu had actually done. They simply trusted the man wearing the expensive suit. Keanu looked around the room, not angrily, almost sadly. Then he turned back toward Gregory. "May I ask you one question?" Gregory sighed impatiently. "What if I'd walked in wearing a tailored suit? Would we still be having this conversation?" Gregory didn't answer because he already knew the answer. Instead, he raised his voice. "So now you're accusing me?" Keanu quietly shook his head. "No, I'm giving you An opportunity to think. Gregory laughed. A sharp, dismissive laugh. I've been managing restaurants for 20 years. I don't need lectures from a man. He looked directly at Keanu's hoodie, who clearly can't afford to eat here. Several guests gasped. Others looked away. Even they knew that had gone too far. Keanu remained seated. His expression never changed. He quietly reached into his pocket. Not for money, not for identification. He simply removed his reading glasses, placed them on the table, then looked calmly at Gregory. I ordered dinner. I'm hungry, and I'd like to finish my meal. Gregory couldn't believe it. You're refusing to leave. I'm choosing to finish dinner. At that exact moment, Liam returned from the kitchen, holding the plate of beef medallions. The aroma filled the air. He hesitated, looking between Keanu and Gregory. I didn't know whether to bring it. Keanu smiled. You made the right choice. Before Gregory could stop him, Liam gently placed the plate in front of Keanu. Keanu thanked him, picked up his knife and fork, cut a small piece, then quietly took his first bite. The entire restaurant watched, as though witnessing something unbelievable. Not because Keanu was being disrespectful, because he refused to be humiliated. Gregory's face turned red. I don't believe this. He pulled out his phone. Right there, in front of every customer, he dialed the police, loud enough for the entire dining room to hear. Hello, this is Gregory Bennett, manager of Hawthorne Grill. We have a trespasser refusing to leave. Yes, I'd like officers sent immediately. He ended the call, looked directly at Keanu, then pointed toward him so every customer could see, and shouted, enjoy your meal while you can, because you're leaving here in handcuffs. You poor bum. The entire restaurant fell silent. Only the sound of rain tapping against the windows remained. Then, outside, red and blue lights reflected across the wet pavement. A police cruiser slowly pulled into the restaurant entrance. Nobody returned to their meal. Nobody resumed their conversation. Every eye turned toward the front doors. Some customers quietly smiled, certain they already knew how this evening would end. Gregory straightened his jacket. His confidence had returned. He folded his arms and looked at Keanu. I gave you every opportunity to leave with dignity. Keanu calmly cut another piece of steak, chewed quietly, swallowed, then took a sip of water. Only then did he answer, I wasn't looking for dignity from someone else. I already have mine. Gregory scoffed. We'll see what the officers think. The restaurant doors opened. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. A man and a woman. Both removed their rain-soaked caps. The male officer looked around. Who made the call? Gregory immediately raised his hand. I did. The officers walked over. Gregory pointed directly at Keanu. That's him. He's refusing to leave. I've asked politely. I've asked repeatedly. And now, he's trespassing. The female officer looked toward Keanu. He remained seated. fork neatly placed beside the plate, hands resting calmly on the table. Not angry, not nervous, just patient. The male officer stepped closer. "Good evening, sir." Keanu looked up. "Good evening, officer. We've had a complaint." "I understand." The officer nodded politely. "Would you mind telling us what happened?" Before Keanu could answer, Gregory interrupted. "It doesn't matter. I've already explained everything. I want him removed." The officer turned back toward Gregory. "I'll speak with him first." Gregory frowned. "Why?" "Because that's our job." The restaurant became quiet again. The officer looked back at Keanu. "Sir, is everything the manager said accurate?" Keanu smiled faintly. "Mostly." The officer looked surprised. "Mostly. He did ask me to leave. And I chose to finish my dinner." The officer glanced at the untouched plate. "You've only had a few bites." Keanu nodded. "I was hungry." Several customers exchanged confused looks. This wasn't turning into the confrontation they had expected. The female officer quietly asked, "Did you threaten anyone?" "No." "Raise your voice." "No." "Refuse to pay." Keanu smiled. "I haven't even received the bill yet." The officers exchanged a quick glance. Nothing about the situation matched the emergency call. Gregory stepped forward again. "Officers, he doesn't belong here." The male officer frowned. "What do you mean?" Gregory looked toward Keanu's hoodie. "I think that's obvious." The officer's expression changed slightly. "You called us because of his clothes." Gregory quickly corrected himself. "No, I called because he's trespassing. He refused to leave." The officer nodded slowly, then quietly asked, "Did he disturb other customers?" "No." "Damage property?" "No." "Threaten staff?" "No." Gregory became impatient. "You're missing the point." The officer calmly replied, "Help me find it." Silence. For the first time, Gregory struggled to answer. The female officer turned toward Liam. "You served him?" "Yes." "Was he polite?" Liam answered immediately. "The politest customer I've had all week." She looked toward the hostess. "You seated him?" "Yes." "Any problems?" She shook her head. "None." Then she looked toward the elderly couple sitting nearby. "I'm sorry to interrupt. Did this gentleman cause you any concern?" The elderly woman smiled warmly. "No, he actually helped one of your waiters before dinner." Her husband nodded. "The only person raising his voice has been the manager." A quiet murmur spread across the restaurant. The mood had begun to shift. Gregory noticed it immediately. He raised his voice again. "That's irrelevant. This is private property. I have every right to remove him." The male officer nodded. "You do." Gregory smiled. Finally, someone understood. Then the officer continued, "But not for the reasons you've given us." Gregory's smile disappeared. "What?" The officer looked toward Keanu, then back at Gregory. "Sir, before we do anything, I need to ask you one important question." Gregory folded his arms confidently. "What is it?" The officer looked him directly in the eyes, then asked calmly, "Who owns this restaurant?" Gregory laughed. "What kind of question is that?" "I work for the owner." The officer nodded. "Excellent. Then I think we should invite them to join this conversation." The confidence slowly disappeared from Gregory's face. The restaurant fell silent. Even the pianist stopped playing. Gregory forced a laugh. "I don't understand," the male officer calmly repeated. "Who owns this restaurant?" Gregory straightened his tie. "Mr. Charles Whitmore, the owner." The officer nodded. "Could you call him?" Gregory frowned. "At this hour, if possible." Gregory looked around the restaurant, then smirked. "You really think he's going to come here?" "Because of him," the officer answered simply. "I'd rather deal with facts than assumptions." Gregory pulled out his phone, confidently dialed the number. A few seconds later, someone answered. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm sorry to disturb you. We've got a situation." He glanced toward Keanu. A customer refused to leave. The restaurant waited. Gregory listened for several moments. Then his expression changed slightly. "He says his name is Keanu." A pause. Then Gregory added, "Keanu Reeves," on the other end of the line. Silence, long enough for Gregory to pull the phone away and check whether the call had disconnected. It hadn't. Then suddenly, a loud voice came through the speaker. "So he's there." Gregory smiled confidently. "Yes, I've already called the police." Another pause. Then the voice became serious. "Don't do anything else." Gregory frowned. "What?" "I'm on my way." The call ended. Gregory looked confused. "He'll be here in 10 minutes." The officer nodded. "We'll wait." The restaurant buzzed with whispers. Customers leaned toward one another, trying to guess why the owner himself was coming. One businessman quietly laughed. "He probably wants to apologize for the inconvenience." Another nodded. "Then he'll throw him out personally." Nobody noticed Keanu quietly finishing another bite of his dinner, as though none of this involved him. 10 minutes later, headlights swept across the restaurant windows. A dark sedan stopped outside. The front doors opened. Charles Whitmore walked in, 71 years old, elegant gray suit, the man who had built Hawthorne Grill into one of the city's finest restaurants. The entire staff immediately straightened. "Good evening, sir." Nobody received a reply. Charles wasn't looking at them. His eyes searched the dining room until they landed on Keanu. Something unexpected happened. Charles smiled, a genuine smile, one that surprised everyone. He walked past Gregory, past the officers, past every customer, stopped beside Keanu's table, then quietly said, "You've been too busy to visit lately." Keanu smiled. "I suppose I have." Charles laughed softly. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten us." The restaurant became completely silent. Gregory blinked. "You know each other?" Charles slowly turned. "I should hope so." Gregory forced a nervous laugh. "Sir, there seems to have been a misunderstanding." Charles looked at him. What misunderstanding? Gregory pointed toward Keanu. I believed he wasn't suitable for the restaurant. Charles looked back at Keanu, then quietly asked, Were you causing trouble? Keanu shook his head. No. Were you rude to anyone? No. Did you refuse to pay? I haven't received the bill yet. Charles nodded. That's what I thought. He slowly faced Gregory again. His expression lost every trace of warmth. You called the police on this man. Gregory swallowed. Yes, I was protecting the restaurant's reputation. Charles quietly replied. No, you were protecting your own assumptions. Gregory looked around nervously. But he looked. Charles raised one hand, stopping him. I know what he looked like. He glanced toward Keanu's faded hoodie, then smiled. He wore that same hoodie the first time we met. Every customer looked confused. Charles slowly walked toward the large fireplace near the entrance. Above it hung dozens of framed photographs. Most customers assumed they were decorations. Charles reached for the oldest frame, removed it carefully from the wall. Behind it, hidden from public view, was another photograph. Smaller, older, its colors had faded with time. Charles carried it back to Gregory. Do you remember your first interview here? Gregory nodded uncertainly. You told me you admired the history of this restaurant. I did. Charles handed him the photograph. Then tell me why you never asked about the man standing beside me. Gregory slowly looked down. The photograph showed Hawthorne Grill 20 years earlier. The building looked almost abandoned. Workers covered in dust, broken windows, construction equipment everywhere. Standing beside Charles, wearing old work clothes, holding a paint roller instead of a briefcase, was Keanu, not posing, working, smiling, like every other volunteer. Gregory frowned. I don't understand. Charles quietly smiled. I thought you might not. He looked around the restaurant, then calmly said words that made every employee forget about dinner, forget about the police, forget about everything else. This restaurant wouldn't exist today if it wasn't for him. Nobody spoke. Not the officers, not the customers, not even Gregory. The photograph remained in his trembling hands. His eyes moved from the young man covered in paint back to the quiet customer still sitting at table 17. It couldn't be. Charles slowly took the photograph back. He looked around the restaurant. I think everyone deserves to know the rest. 20 years earlier, Hawthorne Grill had been days away from closing forever. The bank had refused another loan. Suppliers had stopped delivering food. Employees hadn't been paid for almost 2 months. Charles quietly smiled. I'd already written my resignation letter. He looked toward the kitchen. I gathered everyone together. The chefs, the waiters, the dishwashers. I told them I was sorry. Nobody blamed him. Some cried. Others quietly packed their lockers. One chef even offered to work another month without pay because he couldn't bear watching the restaurant die. Charles sighed. Then This young man walked through the front door. He looked toward Keanu. I'd never met him before. He wasn't wearing a suit. He didn't arrive with lawyers. He simply ordered dinner. Keanu smiled faintly. I remember. Charles laughed. You probably remember. The burnt steak. A few longtime employees chuckled. It was terrible. After dinner, Charles had apologized. I'm sorry. Our kitchen has seen better days. Keanu had looked around the empty dining room, then quietly asked, What's really wrong? Charles hadn't intended to tell a stranger, but something about him made lying impossible. So he told him everything. The debt, the unpaid wages, the bank, the coming closure, everything. Gregory listened in complete silence. This wasn't the story he expected. Charles continued. The next morning, I found him right here. He pointed toward the old photograph, wearing work gloves, holding a paint roller. I thought he'd come to ask for a refund. Instead, Keanu had smiled and said, Where do we start? For 3 straight weekends, he worked beside the staff, painting walls, repairing furniture, cleaning old storage rooms, moving heavy equipment. Not once did he mention who he was. One of the elderly chefs quietly spoke up. I remember. Everyone turned. Chef Antonio, 70 years old. He'd been with the restaurant since it first opened. He slowly walked out of the kitchen, pointing toward Keanu. He burned his hands, helping me repair that old pizza oven. Keanu laughed. I wasn't much help. Antonio smiled. You stayed until midnight. Another waitress stepped forward. Maria. She'd worked there for 18 years. I remember something else. Charles nodded. Go ahead. Maria smiled. My son needed heart surgery. I couldn't afford it. She looked toward Keanu. I never told anyone. But one morning, the hospital called. They said someone had paid the entire bill. Her eyes filled with tears. I spent years trying to find out who. She looked at Keanu. It was you. Keanu quietly shook his head. It wasn't important. Who did it? Maria smiled through her tears. It was to me. Another employee spoke. Then another. Then another. One remembered Keanu paying for culinary school. Another remembered him buying groceries for a dishwasher who'd lost his home in a fire. Someone else remembered finding an envelope containing rent money. Never a name, never recognition, just help. The customers listened in complete silence. The man Gregory had called a poor bum had quietly changed dozens of lives without asking for credit. Gregory slowly looked at Keanu. His voice had almost disappeared. Why did nobody tell me? Charles answered gently. Because he asked us not to. Gregory frowned. But why? Keanu smiled. Because kindness stops being kindness the moment you perform it for applause. The restaurant fell silent again. Even the officers couldn't hide their admiration. Charles slowly walked toward Gregory. You've managed this restaurant for 20 years. You know every wine, every reservation, every VIP guest. He paused. But today, you failed the most important test of your career. Gregory lowered his head. I know. Charles shook his head. No, I don't think. You do. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, pulled out a folded document. Gregory immediately recognized it, not because he'd seen it recently, because he'd signed it the day he became manager. Charles quietly unfolded it, then looked Gregory in the eyes. You wrote these words into every manager's contract. After the renovation, Gregory's face slowly turned pale. He remembered. He just didn't remember the exact wording. Charles looked down at the paper, then slowly began reading. Any manager who publicly humiliates or discriminates against a guest without reasonable evidence shall be subject to immediate termination. Gregory's hands began to shake. He had insisted that clause be added after attending a hospitality conference years earlier. He'd proudly called it the Golden Rule, never imagining one day it would judge him. Charles slowly folded the document, looked at Gregory, then quietly said, Tomorrow morning, I'd like to see you in my office. Gregory swallowed hard because he already knew. Tomorrow, he wouldn't be walking into that office. As the restaurant manager, the restaurant remained silent. Nobody reached for their food. Nobody looked at their phones. Every customer understood. They had just witnessed something far bigger than a disagreement over dinner. Gregory looked at Charles. His voice was barely audible. So, that's it, Charles answered honestly. No, tomorrow is when the paperwork begins. Gregory forced a nervous laugh. I've worked here for 20 years. I gave this restaurant everything. Charles nodded. You did, and I'm grateful. He paused. But one terrible decision can destroy 20 years of good ones. Gregory slowly turned toward Keanu. For the first time that evening, he really looked at him. Not the hoodie, not the boots, not the old pickup truck. The man. You knew this whole time. Keanu nodded. Yes, you could have stopped me the moment I walked over. I could have. Gregory frowned. Then why didn't you? Keanu looked around the dining room, at the customers, at the waiters, at the officers, then quietly answered, because I wanted to see whether you judge the man or the clothes. Nobody spoke. Gregory slowly lowered his head. I failed. Keanu gently shook his head. No, you chose. There's a difference. Those words hit Gregory harder than losing his job because they were true. Every opportunity to stop had belonged to him. The first opportunity, when Liam said, he seems nice, he ignored him. The second, when Keanu politely answered every question, he ignored that too. The third, when customers said Keanu had done nothing wrong, he dismissed them. The fourth, when the officers asked for facts instead of assumptions, he still refused to listen. Nobody had trapped him. Nobody had tricked him. He had simply followed his own prejudice to its natural conclusion. Charles quietly walked toward the officers. "I'm sorry for wasting your time." The male officer smiled. "It wasn't wasted." Charles looked surprised. "What do you mean?" The officer glanced around the restaurant. "Tonight, a lot of people learned something." The female officer nodded. "I wish more calls ended like this." Charles turned back toward Gregory. "I'm placing you on immediate administrative leave. The board will finalize everything tomorrow." Gregory slowly nodded. "I understand." There was no anger left, only regret. Liam quietly approached Keanu's table. "I'm sorry your evening turned into this." Keanu smiled. "You didn't make it happen." Liam laughed softly. "I suppose not." Chef Antonio walked out of the kitchen, carrying a fresh plate. "The first one is cold now." He smiled. "So I made another." Keanu laughed. "You didn't have to." Antonio grinned. "I know, but I'd like to." The entire dining room smiled. For the first time that evening, the tension disappeared. Gregory watched it all. The respect, the warmth, the gratitude, none of it had anything to do with Keanu's wealth. It had everything to do with the life he had quietly lived. Gregory slowly walked toward table 17. Every employee watched. Every customer watched. He stopped beside Keanu. For several seconds, he couldn't find the words. Finally, he quietly said, "I'm sorry," not for losing his job, not because Charles was watching, because he meant it. Keanu looked up. "I believe you." Gregory blinked. "You do?" Keanu nodded. People change when they stop defending their mistakes and start learning from them. Gregory took a deep breath. "Can I ask you one question?" "Of course." Gregory looked directly into Keanu's eyes. The question had been haunting him ever since Charles arrived. He quietly asked, "Why didn't you tell me who you really were?" The restaurant became silent once again. Every employee wanted to hear the answer. Every customer leaned forward. Even Charles waited. Keanu gently placed his knife and fork on the plate, folded his hands, smiled, then prepared to answer the one question that would change Gregory's life far more than losing his job ever could. The restaurant became completely silent. Even the kitchen staff stopped working. Gregory waited. Charles waited. The officers waited. For the first time that evening, nobody cared who had won. They only wanted to understand. Keanu looked at Gregory, then quietly asked, "Can I ask you something first?" Gregory nodded. "Of course." "When I walked through those doors, what was the first thing you noticed about me?" Gregory answered honestly, "Your hoodie, and your boots, and your old truck." Keanu smiled gently. "Exactly. You never noticed that I smiled at your hostess." Gregory lowered his eyes. "You never noticed that I caught your waiter's tray before it fell. You never noticed that I thanked him instead of blaming him. You never noticed that I spoke politely to every person who came to my table, Gregory quietly whispered. No, Keanu nodded. That's why I never told you who I was. Gregory frowned. I still don't understand. Keanu leaned back in his chair. If I'd introduced myself as a billionaire or an investor or someone your owner knew, you would have treated me differently. Gregory slowly nodded. I probably would have. Keanu smiled. But then, you wouldn't have been respecting me. You would have been respecting my success. The words settled over the room. Nobody interrupted, because nobody could. Keanu looked around the restaurant, then quietly continued. The real test was never whether you recognized my name. He looked back at Gregory. It was whether you could respect a complete stranger who looked like he had nothing. Gregory closed his eyes. For 20 years, he'd believed he could read people within seconds. Tonight, he discovered he'd only been reading their clothes. I judged you before I spoke to you. Keanu nodded. You did. I thought I was protecting the restaurant. Keanu smiled sadly. You were protecting an image. He paused. But restaurants don't become memorable because of chandeliers or expensive menus. He looked toward Liam. They become memorable because of how people feel when they walk out the door. Liam quietly smiled. He'd never heard anyone explain hospitality so simply. Keanu looked toward every employee. The hostess made me feel welcome. The waiter treated me with kindness. The chef cooked a wonderful meal. He smiled toward Antonio. And the chef made another one without being asked. Antonio laughed. I couldn't let a good steak go to waste. The restaurant chuckled softly. The tension finally broke. Keanu turned back to Gregory. The only person who made me feel like I didn't belong was the one whose job was to make people feel welcome. Gregory couldn't argue because it was true. Charles quietly walked beside Gregory. I hired you because you understood service. He paused. Somewhere along the way, you started serving appearances instead of people. Gregory slowly nodded. I forgot why I loved this job. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Gregory quietly looked at Keanu. I can't undo what I did tonight. No, Keanu agreed. You can't. Gregory looked down. But I can decide what kind of man I become tomorrow. Keanu smiled. Now, you're asking the right question. Charles placed a hand on Gregory's shoulder. I'll be honest. Gregory looked up. I was angry when I drove here. He smiled faintly. But after hearing this conversation, I hope losing this job becomes the best thing that ever happened to you. Gregory blinked. What? Charles nodded. Sometimes life has to humble us before it can change us. Gregory looked around the restaurant one last time, not at the elegant tables, not at the crystal chandeliers. He looked at every employee, people he'd worked beside for 20 years, people who deserved a better leader. He quietly bowed his head. I'm sorry. This time, he wasn't speaking to Keanu. He was speaking to everyone. As Gregory slowly walked toward the restaurant doors, the rain outside had finally stopped. He reached for the handle, then paused. Across the street, a young, homeless teenager stood staring through the restaurant window. His eyes weren't fixed on the beautiful dining room. They were fixed on the baskets of warm bread being served to customers. Gregory looked at the boy, then looked back at Keanu. For the first time, he didn't see a billionaire. He saw a man who would have invited that boy inside without asking what he was wearing. And suddenly, Gregory understood the lesson he should have learned long before tonight. Nobody noticed the teenager. Nobody except Keanu. He quietly followed Gregory's gaze. The boy couldn't have been older than 16. His clothes were soaked from the rain. His sneakers were falling apart. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, trying to stay warm. But his eyes never left the baskets of fresh bread. Gregory slowly looked back at Keanu. For the first time that evening, he didn't ask for permission. He simply asked, "What would you do?" Keanu smiled. "I think you already know." Gregory stood there for several seconds. Then, without another word, he walked outside. The customers watched through the restaurant windows. The teenager immediately stepped backward. "I'm sorry. I wasn't bothering anyone. I was just looking." Gregory shook his head. "No, you were hungry." The boy looked embarrassed. "A little." Gregory swallowed. Those two words sounded painfully familiar, because only an hour earlier, he would have told the boy to leave. Instead, he opened the restaurant door. "Come inside." The teenager looked confused. "I don't have any money." "I didn't ask if you had money." The boy hesitated. "I'll dirty the floor." Gregory smiled sadly. "We can clean floors. We can't always repair people." The entire restaurant watched as Gregory led the young man inside, not to a corner, not near the kitchen, to the very same table where he'd tried to humiliate Keanu. Gregory looked toward Liam. "What would you recommend?" Liam smiled. "The beef medallions." Gregory laughed. "I was hoping you'd say that." He looked at the teenager. "One beef medallion. And don't bring the bill." The boy's eyes immediately filled with tears. "I can't let you." Gregory gently interrupted him. "Tonight, let someone be kind to you." The atmosphere inside the restaurant had completely changed. The same customers who had watched in silence earlier now smiled. The elderly couple quietly sent over dessert. A businessman asked the waiter to add another meal. A family celebrating an anniversary paid for the teenager's dinner without telling him. One act of kindness quietly became many. Gregory looked at Keanu. "I understand now." Keanu smiled. "What do you understand?" Gregory slowly answered. "A restaurant doesn't earn its reputation by deciding who deserves a table." He looked around the dining room. "It earns it by making sure everyone who sits down is treated like they matter. Charles smiled proudly. There he is. Gregory looked confused. What? The manager I hired 20 years ago. The words caught Gregory completely off guard. I thought I was fired. Charles nodded. You were. Gregory lowered his head. I understand. Charles continued. And tomorrow, the board will officially accept your resignation. Gregory looked surprised. Resignation? Charles smiled. I've decided not to fire you. The entire restaurant looked confused. Even Keanu raised an eyebrow. Charles laughed softly. I've been in business for 50 years. I've learned that arrogance deserves to be fired. He paused, but genuine humility deserves one chance to prove itself. Gregory stared at him. You'd really give me another chance? Charles looked toward Keanu. No, he did. Everyone turned toward Keanu. He smiled. I never asked for your job. I only hoped you'd remember why you chose it. Gregory's eyes filled with tears. Not because he had kept his position, because someone he had humiliated had shown him the mercy he hadn't shown in return. 3 months later, Hawthorne Grill had become one of the most respected restaurants in the city, not because the food had changed. Chef Antonio still made the same famous beef medallions, not because the building had changed. The chandeliers still sparkled. People came because something else had changed. The culture. Every employee, from the dishwasher to the maitre d', followed one simple principle: treat every guest with the same respect before you know who they are. Near the entrance, a small framed plaque appeared. Customers often stopped to read it. It didn't mention Keanu's name. It didn't tell the story. It simply read, character is revealed, not by how we treat important people, but by how we treat those we believe can do nothing for us. One Friday evening, Keanu returned. The same faded hoodie, the same old pickup truck, the same quiet smile. Liam greeted him. Good evening, sir. The usual table. Keanu nodded. If it's available. Liam laughed. It always will be. As Keanu sat down, the restaurant doors opened. A construction worker walked inside. His boots were covered in dust. Several customers looked up, then smiled. The hostess welcomed him exactly the same way. No hesitation, no judgment, no whispers, just, good evening, sir. Welcome. Keanu quietly watched, then smiled to himself. The lesson had finally become a habit. Sometimes, the greatest victory isn't watching someone lose everything. It's watching someone become better because of one mistake. And perhaps that's why the manager who once pointed across a crowded restaurant and shouted, "You're nothing but a poor bum," eventually became the man who greeted every guest exactly the same way, because Keanu never changed the restaurant by proving he was important. He changed it by reminding everyone that every person already is.